Hello and welcome back to another episode of On the Beaten Track. I'm your host, Rihanna. Thank you so much for all the response on YouTube and on the socials for last week's episode. It's always so heartwarming to see how many people really want to learn about our past and really make those connections to our roots. On slavery so far, we've done Gretoa, we've done the stammoeders, we've done the origins of the slaves, where they came from, and we've done the French Huguenots and the Freeburgers last week. To close off this period of the enslaved, I really wanted to look at significant resistance that happened during this time. Never, as I was looking through this, was there a time that people accepted what was happening to them. There was always certain levels of resistance at play. Some people took the route of, as I've spoken about with the stammoeders and Gretoa, was to marry these Europeans and take on their religion as a form of acceptance and protection. Let's take the moment from that first slave who went, wait a minute, and to the eventual emancipation. If we look at everyday resistance, the enslaved people resisted through work slowdowns, sabotage, theft, and maintaining their cultural traditions, which I spoke about, their language, their religion, their songs, despite attempts at the suppression thereof. Enslaved women were particularly active in resisting sexual exploitation, and we've spoken about this at length, sometimes through arson, poisoning, or even killing their abusive owners. The first recorded slave escape happened in Jan came in 1652. The first enslaved people started coming in 1653, and within months the first recorded slave descent occurred. An enslaved man from Guinea named Abraham van Batavia escaped from the fort. He was captured, punished, and used as an example. His defiance set a tone that slavery wouldn't be passively accepted. Then we had Doman of the Korangaikuna. If you remember the Gretoa episode, him, her uncle, and herself were the main interpreters for the Dutch at the Cape. And because Doman was one of those interpreters, he traveled from the Cape to Batavia to gain further training as an interpreter. It was there that Doman saw the devastation associated with colonialism, as Batavia was completely transformed by the Dutch, who had started colonizing it in 1619. He observed that there were very few indigenous people left, and those he saw were reduced to the state of servitude. Upon his return to the Cape, he became outwardly vocal in his dissent of the Dutch. So he came back. He's telling everybody what he saw, and he was very worried that this was going to happen to the Khoi people. He launched the first Khoi-Dutch War in May 1659, and these battles would continue for about a year. The Khoi watch as their water holes and pastures are being swallowed up. At night, the warriors raided Dutch farms, driving off cattle, burning crops, harassing settlers. The Dutch retreated behind their fort walls, building watchtowers and sending out mounted patrols. After a year, they came to a very uncomfortable truce. Nobody really was successful, but you really felt like the Khoi were losing more during these exchanges. And Doman wasn't being assisted by the inland Khoi because they saw him as an opportunist, which is very interesting because he didn't particularly like Gretoa. And they thought that he was just going to use this to dominate trade and relations with the Dutch. This uncomfortable or fragile truce is signed, yet everybody knows now that these settlers are not leaving and they want more. The Dutch grew in strength as they increased their barriers to block and control the Khoi and their movements. Doman saw the future of the Cape, where the Khoi would later be reduced to landless, indentured labor by the Dutch. He saw the negative effects of colonialism on local people before anyone else did, and decided to do everything in his power to fight it. He was a true activist and warrior and wasn't afraid to take on the Dutch without Khoi allies, because they weren't coming together to fight them. By the time the Second Dutch-Khoi War erupts in 1673, the Dutch are stronger, and the divided Khoi cannot match firepower. Over the next 4 years, many clans lose their cattle, their land, and their independence. By 1677, the wars are effectively over, and the Dutch are the masters of the Cape. The cost to the Khoi was devastating. Their land is fenced off, the best pastures claimed by the settlers. Their cattle, the heart of their society, are seized or lost. Their freedoms disappears as they are forced to work as servants on these Dutch farms. Numbers dwindle through the war, but through a smallpox epidemic that swept through the Cape, killing thousands. Some Khoi flee inland, others merge with the San hunter-gatherers. Many remain near the Dutch, slowly absorbed into the colonial economy, their culture eroded, and their independence gone. The Khoi-Dutch Wars were not vast battles remembered in epic songs, but they were turning points. They marked the beginning of the colonial dispossession in South Africa. The story is not only about defeat, it was the first major resistance. It is about Doman, about communities who tried to defend their world against the empire. Then when I was at the slave lodge, they have this whole section that's dedicated to the Meermin ship. So what happened on the ship? In February 1766, a Dutch slaver ship was taken control of by the enslaved crew. The enslaved crew, including a man called Masafana and Kusaj, took control of the vessel in order to steer it back to Madagascar. The surviving and captured crew members convinced them that they would take them back to Madagascar. Of course, they lied, and they steered the vessel towards Dresby, where the surviving slaves were captured. I should have done a disclaimer that not all of these resistance ended well for the resistors. Deceived, about 50 to 70 Malagasy on board went ashore near Dresby. They were met by local militia and farmers who interpreting the arrival as distress, attacked. Many Malagasy were killed or captured. Those remaining aboard surrendered. The Meermin ran aground and broke apart on the coast. About half the crew and up to 30 Malagasy captives were killed during the uprising. Masavana died 3 years later in Robben Island, while Kusaj lived for another 2 decades in exile there. Then through the 1970s, there was the French and Haitian revolutions, and this news of Haiti spread to the Cape. It inspired both fear among the settlers and hope among the enslaved people. Slave workers in Cape Town began discussing revolt more openly, though surveillance by the VOC was intense. Then we come to the Jij Rebellion. Then we come to the Jij Rebellion, which, if you see, it's spelled not like Jij in Afrikaans, assuming it's the Dutch spelling, but I'll explain why I'm laughing at the Jij word. On the 27th of October, 1808, led by a Mauritian slave tailor who went by the name of Louis. He was called Louis van Mauritius, these names. He was inspired by, my husband's going to kill me, Toussaint Louverture, the leader of the Haitian slave revolt. You see the 2 pictures, same, but different. How did this happen? How did it begin? It began when Louis met 2 Irishmen, James Hooper and Michael Kelly, at a waterfront bar, which is now Strand Street. So Rihanna, Strand Street is the middle of town. How is it waterfront? the Cape looked different back then. So Louis later claimed that they were telling him that slavery had ended in Europe and the Americas. On this day, which ended up being like 326 of them altogether, so that included enslaved people, schooner laborers, and these two Irish sailors, participated in an organized rebellion from the Swartland farming wheat belt at a farm called Volgelgesang in Malmesbury. Now, when they said these guys came from Malmesbury and they were eventually caught in Salt River, I was like, how long would that take you to walk? Currently, if I look at the map, could take between 14 and 15 hours. So I don't know which route they took, but these rebels, they marched on 34 farms from there to here. They increased their numbers along the way and took farmers and their family prisoners and then marched to Cape Town. Their aim was to hoist the bloody red flag and fight until they were free. The slaves had no training in waging battle, and the end game of their plan had little chance of success, but their want for freedom, their desire for freedom was greater than the fear of the obstacles that they were facing. The resistors themselves were not overly physically violent. The farmers they had encountered during this, I want to call it the big walk, through this, moving from farm to farm, the farmers were mishandled and tied up, but no lives were lost. The property of the farmers, however, did suffer. In most cases, the farms were completely looted of all horses, arms, ammunition, and wine. Mere 36 hours after the insurrection began, it was quelled as the group was met at Salt River. The uprising, though relatively unsuccessful, it was an extremely significant event. It represented the new sense of resentment felt amongst the enslaved in the Cape Colony towards the end of the 18th century. During this uprising, they didn't assert themselves through physical violence and intimidation. They asserted themselves symbolically. In those 36 hours, they reversed the slave-master relationship. They gave orders to the masters while holding a sjambok. They addressed them as Jy and not E, which was the respectful and the expected way for slaves to address their master. Today, we still go, when you're speaking to an adult, you go E, and when you're speaking to, it's like the vous and tu in French. It's more familiar, Jy, respectful E. So Abraham, one of the original instigators of the insurrection, aptly explained to a slave woman weeping for their master, tomorrow the troop will hoist a red flag and fight itself free, and then the slave women will be able to say yay to their mistresses. What do they say? It's the little things in life. Why did the farmers not resist more and defend their property and their families? We can probably put it down to three things. The sheer sight of such a massive and organized group would have confirmed the very worst nightmare of many European farmers in the Cape at the time. The group were well armed and would have easily overpowered any farmer, making resistance almost impossible. Furthermore, the group moved really quickly from farm to farm, allowing them to catch each farmer by surprise. Couldn't phone the other person and tell them what's happening. Also because they took a lot of the farmers with them on their big walk into Cape Town. The troops managed to capture 326 of the marchers. Of the 326, 47 were put on trial. Louis himself and one of the Irishmen, James Hooper, were found guilty of treason and sentenced to be hanged. A further 11 were sentenced to death for active participation, while others were given lesser sentence, including imprisonment on Robben Island. Here at Robben Island. always in the mix. Louis boldly managed to escape prison after he was condemned, but he was apprehended and returned by a reward seeker. And if you're a little bit squeamish, maybe skip past this part. After he was hanged, his body was slung in chains to rot at the beginning of Koeberg Road. His head was put on a spike as a deterrent to other slaves, feeling very like Game of Thronesy. While the rebellion was short-lived, its effects was most certainly felt. In the years to follow, more of the enslaved at the Cape stood their ground, and rather than deserting as they had in the past, began to demand rights within the colony. The Caledon Code came next in 1809. It was introduced under the British rule. It restricted Khoi and freed slaves, binding them to labor contracts. This was met with widespread desertion and legal challenges, with Khoi and ex-slaves using colonial courts to resist exploitation. You have to wonder what that looked like. Then we had these slave soldiers and Kuna militia on the frontier. While not individually named, many Kuna were forcibly conscripted into militias by European frontiersmen. These militia hunted sand people and captured children as forced labor. These conscripted Kuna functioned as slave-like labor, forming part of the regional coercive system outside the formal Cape slave economy. We had Chief David Stuurman, who was a significant Khoi leader and activist who fought against Dutch and British colonialism in the Eastern Cape, leading rebellions and forming alliances with the Xhosa people between 1799 and 1890, also known as the Third Frontier. Stuurman formed a strong alliance with the Xhosa people, combining forces to fight against the colonial powers. Known for his fierce resistance, he was imprisoned on Robben Island and successfully escaped twice. Not once, twice. It's amazing. Before being exiled to Australia, where he eventually died in 1830. There is talk that he was actually freed in Australia and was waiting to come back on a boat to South Africa, but he had a leg injury and had to wait for it to heal. And unfortunately, during that time, he passed. His legacy is celebrated today as a symbol of Khoi resistance and freedom. Thank you for your service. Then we had Itola prophet and warrior Makana, who was a prominent Xhosa leader whose mother was Khoi, who rose to become a war doctor and spiritual advisor, leading a major attack against the British at Grahamstown in 1890. Makana led an attack of 10,000 Xhosa warriors against the British garrison at Grahamstown, seeking to drive the colonial forces out of the land. He surrendered to the British in hopes of promoting peace, but was imprisoned on Robben Island, where he later drowned during an escape attempt. Makana is remembered as a symbol of resistance against British colonialism. Amazing, guys. Unfortunate the end, but amazing. Then we have Galant van der Gaab, also a frontier slave rebel. Galant was a 25-year-old enslaved man in the Khoi-Bothaveld region. In 1825, led a revolt involving 12 slave and Kuna Basta laborers, during which they killed his master and 2 others. The primary reason for Galant's rebellion was revealed in the subsequent investigation. Galant was subjected to severe beatings by his master, who sent him to prison for discipline. He thrice reported to colonial authorities the ill treatment he received from his master, but the authorities took no action. Galant had reported that his master stole his possessions, but they wouldn't say stole, they would say took his possessions. But his report also came to naught. Amen. At this time, the governor of the Cape issued a proclamation announcing the amelioration of slavery. The farming community, while discussing it, misunderstood that they were being freed. Given their masters' ill treatment of them, they believed that the master would have them imprisoned so they wouldn't have to free them. Galant launched the uprising to fight this injustice. Galant and the people that he mobilized killed his master and 2 others before fleeing into the surrounding mountains. A commander was dispatched from the Cape and captured Galant and his supporters. They were tried and convicted of murder, resulting in the execution of Galant and 2 others. There's this massive mural that I'll put up and zone in on the part that has him in it. It's absolutely beautiful in the Slave Lodge. I highly recommend, if you haven't been, to go. If you have been and forgotten what you saw there many years ago, maybe it's time to return. Then we had the prize slaves. We spoke about this before in other episodes, but in the 1820s and to the 1830s, the prize slaves, because this is when slavery was abolished and it was illegal to bring slaves into South Africa. What they did was they brought these prize slaves, which was apprentices. They called them apprentices. They brought them largely from Mozambique and Madagascar, and they apprenticed them in regions like Natal and the Eastern Cape. Some resisted these conditions by fleeing to local societies like the Zulu and the Xhosa, while their individual names are seldom preserved. Records contain glimpses such as a poignant account of a man named Zambu, a prize slave who requested the return of his 6-year-old child from an indentured placement. In the past episodes, I have spoken about the Hangklip Haven community. Some runaway slaves established these Maroon communities that survived away from the control of their masters, but not necessarily away from the colony. The Hangklip and Table Mountain slave communities are 2 examples that thrived outside the control of the Cape government. Hangklip survived primarily because of its proximity of the mountains to the coast. The former provided security while the latter provided food such as fish and mussels. Furthermore, the community was in areas where there were few access routes in and an invading force would be spotted easily. Commanders attempting to raid the community returned empty-handed or with slaves that were not connected to the Hangklip community at all. Guns were acquired for defense, but these needed a regular supply of gunpowder and gun flints. Consequently, the Maroon community was never able to cut itself completely off of the rest of the colonial society, and for this reasons they were vulnerable. Court and commanders suggested perhaps around 50 at its peak, including men, women, and children. Runaway slaves joined at times by Khoi, deserter soldiers or sailors, and free blacks. Leander Burgess, the leader of the community, visited Cape Town several times to obtain supplies for the group. Despite attempts to destroy the Hangklip community by the Cape government and internal squabbles, the community survived from the 1720s to the 1830s. How amazing is that? Must be hard in all this, living in the mountains. Let's close off this episode with coming to where we ended, which is the emancipation of the slaves. So from 1825 to 1834, we had slaves use arson, poisoning, and desertion to resist worsening conditions. They were using these ways to resist. So enslaved domestic workers in Cape Town were at the heart of several conspiracies to burn down sections of the town. This is how bad it was. Then we had the eventual emancipation of slaves. Slavery was abolished in the Cape on the 1st of December in 1834. But a 4-year apprenticeship system apprenticeship system kept enslaved people bound to their former masters. This sparked protest. So how did these people resist? Massive desertion. They just walked out. Apprentices fled farms in large numbers. Hundreds signed petitions sent to Britain, often through missionaries. They have collective go-slows and work stoppages on farms. Khoi prophets and church leaders used spiritual authority to encourage resistance. By 1838, mass resistance helped force the British to finally grant full emancipation. Even though it was abolished across the empire in 1808, if I'm not mistaken, you had until 1838 when they finally granted people full emancipation. Thank you so much for listening through these episodes. It's really been my great pleasure to do this research, find these people, find these little stories about how the resistance happened or what happened to our people or who these people were. As we go into further into the 19th century and 20th century, things don't always get better for us as a people. But when we come out on the other side, where we are now today, it's something to be applauded. Every year on Mandela's birthday, have a little cry. Every time I sing the national anthem at a rugby match, because it's 10-1 going to be at a rugby match, I cry. I look at my family, my husband, my children, and my mum and dad, and his mum, and their close relationship. Those things wouldn't have been possible if people didn't keep resisting. Thank you so much for listening. Come back next week. It's a toss-up what's coming. I haven't decided yet. I have been quite busy for the last 2 weeks trying to put everything together. When it's a really messy kind of put this there, put this there, put this there. And then one day I just have to decide what the episode's going to be. And that's when I put it all together. So it's a surprise to me too, what we come on with next. But thank you so much for listening. Please like and subscribe where you're listening. Let's get to that 100 subscribers, which is our first milestone. Yeah, have an amazing day and we'll see each other later. Mwah, mwah, mwah. Thank you. Bye.